Thanks for coming along tonight, folks, where Dave Sharma makes a welcome return to the Sydney Institute. He's been here before. Look, he's well known to all of you here, so I'll introduce him briefly. Background in DFAT as a diplomat, Australian ambassador to Israel, worked in business, the member for Wentworth in the House of Representatives 2019 to 2022, and a senator from December 2023. He is speaking here tonight on the challenge for Australia, restoring our competitive edge. So Senator Sharma will talk on his topic, then we'll do a questions discussion. I'm sure he's happy to go a bit wider than what he's going to talk on here. So if anyone wants to talk about foreign policy or whatever, you're welcome to do it. But now we've got an important speech on our competitive edge. Dave Sharma, you're very welcome.
Thanks so much, Gerard. Well, to the Sydney Institute and especially Anne and Gerard Henderson, thank you for the invitation to speak. And the Sydney Institute's abiding belief in the free contest of ideas and the encouragement of respectful debate and discussion are what underpins a free and liberal society, and it makes the Sydney Institute both a cherished and a critical national institution. It's almost impossible to imagine today, but 25 years ago, in the year of the Sydney Olympics, the world was coming to Australia to learn about our economic miracle. I know because as a young graduate in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, I spent a week taking a notable South Korean economist around our major institutions and leadership at the time to study the Australian model, as it was called. And back then, we were the comeback kid of the global economy. After decades at the back of the pack, a wave of bold structural reforms had turbocharged Australian productivity and put us at the front. So Australia's economy, which had underperformed all other advanced nations, the OECD, in the 60s and 70s and 1980s, had outperformed these countries in the 1990s and went on to do so in the 2000s. How do we do this? We cut taxes, we reformed the tax system, we liberalised and deregulated the financial sector, we gave the central bank independence in setting monetary policy, we privatised assets, we initiated the national competition policy, and the result was we had an economic speed limit that was the envy of the world. Other nations wanted to know how we did it. Tony Blair quite famously visited Australia to learn the secret of our economic success shortly before he became Britain's Prime Minister. And I tell you this anecdote because today the situation's completely reversed. No one comes to Australia to learn about economic success anymore. Once again, we are falling to the back of the pack. And the numbers here don't lie. On living standards, we are quite simply the worst performing country in the developed world. While living standards across the OECD, the Club of Advanced Nations, have grown by 5% on average since 2022, in Australia ours have shrunk by 7%. Our economy per person, the best measure of individual well-being, has gone backwards in 9 out of the last 12 quarters. And on productivity, the very engine of our past economic success, we are now ranked second last amongst developed countries, behind only Mexico. So let me be blunt. The productivity surge that created the economic miracle in Australia of the 1990s and the 2000s is over. And today we are in a productivity slump, and it's costing every Australian. For generations, to my mind, the Australian promise was simple but profound. Your children would be materially better off than you were. And in the Australia of the post-war era, living standards doubled roughly every 35 years, every generation. And this was the generational compact at work. It meant that each generation enjoyed higher incomes, better health and education, more opportunity. Each generation lived longer and healthier lives. They had more satisfying and varied professional careers. enjoyed more leisure, and in turn gave their children more opportunities than they themselves enjoyed. And to achieve this doubling of living standards every generation, Australia's long-term annual growth rate, when measured as GDP per capita, was 2%. But that promise, that generational compact, is now broken. Our long-term growth rate over the past decade was more like 1%. And in the past 3 years, going back now to mid-2022, real GDP per person, the growth in that, has not just flatlined, it's gone backwards, declining by 1%. So our economy per person is actually going backwards. The only thing keeping our headline GDP figures positive is high migration. And that is to confuse population growth with prosperity. They're not the same thing. Our national pie is getting slightly bigger, but everyone's share of that national pie is getting steadily smaller. The Reserve Bank just in August, 2 months ago, downgraded its long-range productivity forecast to Australia to 0.7%. Now, even that would be a big improvement on our current performance. In the last year, for instance, productivity has not grown at all. Since March 2022, it's fallen by 5%. But even on this optimistic forecast of the Reserve Bank of Australia, it will now take roughly 100 years, or 3 generations, for living standards to double. Think about that. We've gone from every 35 years now to a century. And that means that the Australian dream of getting ahead is being deferred, not to our children, not to our grandchildren, but to our great-grandchildren. This isn't just a statistical blip or a material factor. It's a profound threat, as I see it, to our way of life and our social and political compact. So how do we get here? How do we go from being a model to a cautionary tale? The Reserve Bank and other experts point to several causes, but they can be boiled down to 3 critical failures. First, our economy has lost its pulse. Joseph Schumpeter famously called the cycle of economic dynamism creative destruction. And it's the essential process where new ideas challenge old and new businesses challenge legacy businesses. But if you look at the top 20 companies on our ASX, the top 20 companies in Australia by market capitalisation, 2/3 of them were there 25 years ago. If you look at the same industry in the United States, only 1/4 of today's faces were there 25 years ago. So whilst the United States got companies like Nvidia, like Amazon, like Google, like Apple, we got the same familiar faces. And our corporate sector today looks less like a dynamic marketplace and more like a closed shop. Second, we've become slow to seize the future. The RBA calls this slower technological diffusion, but what it means is we're too slow to adopt and adapt game-changing tools and technologies. And now, as we stare at the greatest productivity opportunity in a generation, artificial intelligence, what's the government's response? It has been to suggest that unions should exercise a veto over its deployment and over its use. This is like giving the horse and buggy lobby a veto over the motor car. It's a retrograde mindset that treats AI, artificial intelligence, as a threat to be combated, not an opportunity to be seized. Now, interestingly, the 2025 Nobel Prize in Economics was just awarded yesterday. And it was awarded to a trio of economists, Joel Mocker, Philippe Aghion and Peter Howard, for their research proving the importance of both of these factors for economic growth. Aghion and Howard explained how new technologies and innovations displace older ones, leading to a dynamic process of economic growth where new industries emerge and outdated ones decline. Creative destruction at work. Whilst Mocker's work highlights the importance of a culture and a mindset that is open to new ideas and new technologies for economies to grow and to thrive. And Australia needs to take both these lessons to heart. And thirdly and finally, in Australia, we are being strangled by our own rules and by our own rulers. Red tape, for instance. The Corporations Act in Australia is now literally longer than War and Peace. The Fair Work Act has 561 new pages to it, added courtesy of this government. We are burying our businesses and our entrepreneurs in paperwork and in compliance costs. And the only ones who benefit from this scenario are established players who can afford the lawyers. Runaway government spending. We have government spending growing at 4 times faster than the economy. And what that means is it's acting like a giant vacuum cleaner, sucking up capital, sucking up skills, sucking up labour, and sucking up resources that our private sector desperately needs to grow. Government spending now as a share of the economy is the highest that it's been outside of the pandemic in 40 years, going back to 1986. And government debt, a measure of that, is set to hit $1 trillion this year. Interest payments alone on this debt, which come in at $50,000 per minute, are one of the fastest growing items in our budget, growing interest payments on our debt. You see this in job creation figures. In the past few years, 80% of employment, 4 out of 5 new jobs, have been in the so-called non-market sector of the economy. That is the part of the economy that is either government-owned or government-funded. We also have self-inflicted energy costs. 20 years ago, in Australia, we had some of the cheapest energy in the world. It was a core competitive advantage. Today, thanks to a flawed energy transition, it's become a comparative disadvantage. We've turned what was our cheapest weapon into our heaviest anchor. 2 decades ago, for instance, our electricity prices were lower than those of Canada and 1/4 that of Japan. 2 decades later, today, our electricity prices are now twice as high as Canada and higher than Japan. That's at least a 4-fold deterioration. And the evidence for this economic malaise that we are seeing is all around. Private sector investment is at a 33-year low. Spending on research and development is at a decade low. And both of those indices indicate a profound lack of confidence in Australia's economic future. Now, if this continues, the pain will be felt everywhere. We won't be able to afford the defence forces we need, the infrastructure we require, the social services we cherish. But the most dangerous consequence will be what it does to our politics. Economic growth is the glue that holds an optimistic society together. It allows for win-win outcomes. But in a stagnant economy, politics becomes a zero-sum contest. If the pie isn't growing, the only way to get a bigger slice is to take it from someone else. And it becomes young versus old, worker versus business, asset owners versus income earners. And we are already seeing this toxic and populist language creep into our discourse. And this is how we get in Australia a tale of two nations. One, the confident, growing, outward-looking Australia of our past, of the era of the Sydney Olympics. And the other, a stagnant, resentful, inwardly focused Australia, where politics is about competition over a shrinking sum of national resources. And that is the future we must choose to reject. Now, this may sound like a dystopian vision, but we are already seeing elements of such zero-sum discourse creep into Australia. Older Australians, with their higher levels of home ownership, are increasingly being targeted by the Greens and blamed for current levels of housing unaffordability. Treasurer Jim Chalmers wrapped up Labor's economic summit by promising to fix, and I quote here, intergenerational inequity, coded speak for hitting the elderly with more taxes. People with self-managed super funds, labelled as wealthy, have only narrowly been avoided, as of yesterday, hit with a new, novel and untested tax on unrealised gains proposed by the Treasurer. Corporate Australia is having any number of novel and new taxes and regulations proposed upon it. And increasingly, this is the language of political discourse in Australia. Zero-sum economics, where the task of government is basically to redistribute benefit and burden. Now, stagnant economies provide the breeding ground for populism, with its identification of villains, with its simplistic solutions. And if you look around the world today, it's the economically most stagnant nations of Europe in particular where populist political parties are gaining the strongest footholds. And if Australia's economy remains stagnant, then we too will fall victim to this sort of populism, this sort of toxic politics. What is the way forward? Well, I want to say this very clearly and unashamedly. Economic growth is a good thing. And the single most powerful driver of growth is competition. Competition, just as on the playing field, as in the economy. It's what keeps businesses honest. It drives innovation. It lifts wages. It builds homes cheaper and quicker. It keeps prices lower. It's the wellspring of productivity. It's what stops our economy from becoming lazy and complacent. But right now in Australia, we have a competition deficit. And the current government's answer is always the same. More regulation, more intervention, more government. They are obsessed with policing the size of Tim Tam packets, their so-called war on shrinkflation, while ignoring the structural rot. Now, our answer as Liberals is the opposite to that. More competition, not more regulation. Smaller government, a larger and more vibrant private sector. We need in Australia a new wave of bold structural economic reform, just like in the 1990s and the 2000s. We need a Hilmer 2.0. We need a Wallace 2.0. And our plan must be built on three core principles. Firstly, unleashing enterprise. We must cut the regulatory deadweight that is holding back business. We need to rein in out of control government spending that is starving the private sector of resources. And we need to deliver affordable and reliable energy because we cannot be competitive as a nation with globally uncompetitive energy prices. Secondly, we need to ignite and embrace competition once again. We need to be rolling out the red carpet for investors, not red tape. We want more global players entering our market to challenge the incumbents and more homegrown upstarts doing the same, whether it's in banking, in supermarkets, in financial services or airlines or telecommunications. Competition rather than regulation should be the default setting of our entire economy, but in recent years it has become the reverse of that. And thirdly, we need to embrace the future with confidence, with optimism. We must champion new technology like artificial intelligence, not shun it. We must make it easier for businesses to hire workers, for startups to raise capital, and we must choose to be a nation that builds the future rather than runs away from it. Under this Labor government, though, what we have emerging is the transition to a managed economy and a creeping regulatory state. Let's look at Labor's record here. They've introduced a raft of new mergers reforms, the complexity of which threaten to have a chilling effect on commercial transactions across the economy. They're all over the shop when it comes to artificial intelligence, a technology that could help massively lower barriers to entry in established industries. They've added considerably to the regulatory burden in Australia, as my colleague, Senator Andrew Bragg, pointed out here just a couple of months ago. They are threatening now to introduce so-called ex-ante competition laws, a European import that would wrap some of our most innovative companies in a regulatory straitjacket. They massively complicated our industrial relations regime, making it both riskier and more expensive for businesses to take on workers. And up until yesterday they were pursuing a new tax on unrealised gains, a measure that threatened to starve Australia's private companies and startups of early stage risk-oriented growth capital. Labor has a $900 million national competition fund, which sounds good, but none of those $900 million have been spent. I started with an anecdote about the Olympics and I'm going to end with one. In 1976, when our team of 184 athletes set out for the Montreal Olympics, the hopes of the nation were high. But our athletes that year returned home without a single gold medal. It was our worst ever ranking at an Olympics. It was the first time since 1936 that Australia had come home without a gold medal. But the national shock it provoked became the catalyst for a ruthless overhaul. What happened in the years subsequent was we centralised a fragmented state-based system. We established the Australian Institute of Sport. We took what was a ramshackle cottage industry of well-meaning amateurs and grounded it in science and infused it with expertise and discipline and professionalism. And a quarter of a century later, or slightly less, 24 years, Australia's transformation in sport was complete. The Sydney Olympics in 2000 saw us capture the largest number of medals we ever have and finish fourth on the medal table. Well, today, in economic terms, we are having our Montreal moment. In 2004, for instance, we were ranked as the fourth most competitive economy in the world, where we ended up at the Olympics in 2000. This year, in terms of the global competitiveness rankings, we are at 18th. Now, if this were the Olympics and that were the medal tally, that would put us somewhere between Iran and Ukraine. This should be our wake-up call. The same Australian attitude that rightly demands excellence in sports must demand it for our economy as well. It's our duty to future generations to restore the generational compact that has gone missing. The consequences of stagnation, or worse, continued decline, are not just dented national pride. Unlike the Olympics, they are more significant and they are more profound. The good news is we have time, and I believe we have the national will to act, but it must be action, not just talk of future abundance, not just endless government-sponsored roundtables. It must be action that we see. My proposition is simple. Competition leads to better productivity and lower prices. Productivity leads to economic growth, and economic growth delivers a better Australia today and a better future for our children. The role of government is not to preside over a managed national decline. It's instead to chart a path that will make our economy once more one the world can envy and learn from. Thank you.
Now, you went back to the Montreal Games of 1976, where we only got no gold medals. I think only got one medal. Malcolm Fraser had been elected in December 75, and he got blamed in 76, as I recall, for our poor performance here by sections of the media. But was it that so much, or what about the recession of 82, 83? Because what I thought was that the recession of 82, 83 prompted reform that encouraged John Howard to do what he was trying to do in the Liberal Party against a lot of opposition, but he got it through, and also then Hawke and Keating in the Labor Party. So does it come off failure in sport, or does it come more from failure in the economy, the drive to competition?
Look, I think that's a good point, Gerard. I think the failure of the Montreal Olympics sort of drove us on in a narrow endeavour, which is to improve our sporting performance. But the shock of the 82-83 recession, but more profoundly, a longer sense that the Australian model was fundamentally broken, is what allowed us to embrace a whole lot of reform and liberalisation in the 80s, pursued by the Labor government under Hawke and Keating, supported by John Howard in particular when in opposition, and followed through by the Howard government from the mid-90s onwards.
Oh, that was fast. Thank you for your comments, Senator. Your Montreal Olympics metaphor is quite interesting. The centralisation of power and government resources to form the AAS is also the same thinking that got us the NBN, Snowy 2.0, NDIS, the list continues.
I realise the parallel has its limits.
Yes, but your list of reforms of the 80s and 90s omitted industrial relations. And the coalition has been, dare I say, silent for nearly 20 years on the subject, despite two tsunamis of reform from the Labor governments. What is the view of the current coalition on industrial relations?
So look, you make an important point. Industrial relations reform was a big part of the reform of the 80s and 90s, and Paul Keating, to his credit, was a pioneer. And what we've seen the Labor government do is basically reverse the industrial relations clock to, before the Hawke-Keating era. Enterprise bargaining is almost finished. Centralised wage fixation is rising ascendant. I think as the Liberals, we have to address this. I think there has been an element within our political movement that has been gun-shy about touching this since work choices in the 2007 election, but I don't think it's sustainable because Labor is an input into everything. Labor productivity is one of the worst performing indices in Australia, and all the evidence indicates that the more we have sought to centralise and impose uniformity in our industrial relations system, the worse our productivity and innovation record has become. And I'm firmly of the view that people like to put a capital versus Labor construct around this. Some of the most damaging things the Labor government has introduced in this past few years are basically denying workers agency to allow them to work flexible hours, allow them to work from home potentially, by basically imposing a one-size-fits-all approach on the labour market. And ultimately, I think that's bad for labourers, it's also bad for businesses, and it's bad for the economy. So I think this is an area we must be prepared to tackle and embrace, and we need to be bold enough to make the case for why this is a huge challenge for economic performance.
Thank you, Anne. Look, I'm probably the only person in the room who went to the Olympics in 1956. And I was on the organising committee behind the 2000 Olympics. And with God's blessing, I might be able to go to Brisbane for the next Olympics.
Okay,
I saw Chilla thing. My question to you is about the Constitution itself. Now, you have mentioned it. Is it? I think it's a very good constitution, and it was carefully crafted by our forebears. Are there any flaws in that enable us to move ahead?
Look, I think there's a number of ways I could answer that, but I would pick on one thing in particular. I think 3-year parliamentary terms are a hindrance to some of the long-term reforms and difficult decisions we need to have. It's very unusual by the standards of Westminster democracies around the world. Most executives have at least a 4-year parliamentary term, often 5. All of our states and territories have at least 4-year terms for governments. And I think that is something that would require constitutional change in Australia. And it would also require some consideration of what would happen to people like me in the upper house. Would we move on to a single 4-year term, or would senators have 8-year terms? But I think a 4-year term is a hindrance in many respects to the timing of the political cycle and the time it takes to identify a problem, devise solutions, sell them, retail them, implement them, and be able to harvest some of the rewards from it. And I think that is a challenge in Australia. Generally speaking, I would say it's something that attracts bipartisan support. I mean, Peter Dutton mentioned it at the last election campaign. Anthony Albanese is on the record as being in favour of it, but he has also ruled out, as I understand it anyway, when in London, any further attempts at constitutional change this term of Parliament.
Senator, thank you. I know I'm biased, but that was a pretty decent and accurate presentation. But given the calibre of much of the media, how would you propose getting your presentation and all its ideas across to the majority of the electorate?
What I've learned during my time in politics is the importance of repetition. And it's something that I didn't really believe until I entered politics. I sort of thought you could make a point once and people would absorb it and appreciate it and internalise it and reflect it. But no, I've slowly learned over time that in politics the most important thing is repetition. But I think, look, on the very tactical level, I'm sending my speech to the press gallery. I'll make sure I promote it far and wide. But I think it's important that we bring what is a comparatively dry topic, if you like, of economic performance, which can cause people's eyes to glaze over, and bring it to life with consequence and meaning. So, you know, my Olympics anecdote was an attempt at that. But I think when people realise that their children are not going to inherit a better world than they are, and possibly a worse one, and people already know this and grapple with it, whether you're a grandparent helping pay your grandchildren's school fees, whether you're a parent helping your child make a deposit on a house. People know that the system is straining. To bring to life why that is and the causes of that, and that they're within our capacity to address as a nation. They're not the result of external shocks or the weather or factors beyond our control. They're the result of an accumulation of national choices we've made. I think that's what we need to do to allow people to envisage a future other than what they see today. It takes a bit of imagination, I think, for people to imagine that things could be other than as they are right now. But the more, you know, we in politics and the political game can say, it doesn't need to be like this. We can fix this. The more I think we will have success. But it's a work in progress.
Thank you. Salvatore Babonis at the University of Sydney.
Of course, Salvatore, nice to see you. I knew I'd recognise you.
I agree with everything you've said, sincerely. But most people don't realise that labour productivity is arithmetically measured as GDP per hour worked.
Yes.
The number of hours worked in Australia increased by 9% between 2022 and 2024 due to massive low-skill immigration through the short-term immigration program. GDP growth would have had to be a real 6.5% annual growth since 2022 in order to absorb that workforce and maintain the global average 2% productivity growth. That seems extremely unlikely to ever have occurred. Why isn't anyone addressing immigration as the driver of productivity malaise?
I think it's a very good question. I think we should be prepared to address immigration levels. I'll make these points. Firstly, our immigration policy is a legitimate matter of public debate and discourse in Australia, and people of goodwill can have different views over that. There is nothing sacrosanct in Australia about any particular immigration level, and people should be entitled to make the case for why immigration levels should be higher or lower. It is my view, and I think it's the view of many of my colleagues, that immigration levels to Australia in the last 3 years in particular have been unsustainably high. Both because of what it's doing to our economy and productivity growth, but also because of our ability, any nation's ability, to be able to absorb and house and school and feed and clothe and provide employment for a large number of people, and to socially and culturally integrate them. Having 1 million people in net terms, roughly speaking, move to Australia over the past 2 years is gigantic for a nation of 25, 26 million people. It's almost unprecedented in the annals of the world. There'd be small periods when there were equally large people movements, but it undoubtedly places a strain on institutions, both political and economic and cultural and social. So I think we will always be a net migration country, and I think that will help us address any number of challenges. But we need to make sure that the immigration program is working in Australia's national interest. And that means the number needs to be right, and the skills mix and the age profile needs to be right. We are entirely free to discriminate in our migration program on the basis of age or skill or English language capability or level of education. And in the past, I think that's how we've run the migration program. What we've seen, I think, under the last 2 years, for a range of reasons, some of which are plausible, others of which are not, far exceed both government projections but also our ability to manage and integrate these new cohort of people.
Question here from one of our Zoomers, and Dennis from Canberra asks, what does the path to smaller government look like, and what is the appropriate role of government in the economy?
Well, look, today, just in absolute terms, I mean, federal government spending as a share of the economy today is will reach 27% of GDP. The average over the last 15 to 20 years is more like 24%. So that's 3 extra percentage points of resources that government is consuming. I would say again that the right size of government, how to get smaller government is to get government spending down to basically 24% of GDP, and we want tax revenue over the economic cycle to be roughly in line with that. So we're balancing the budget over the economic cycle. I know this can be an easy thing to say. It can be a harder thing to say. How are we going to get there? But in part, we can get there if the economy grows more quickly, then the call on government is less, and the call on revenue can be less. But we also need to get control of some of our very expensive entitlement programs, and foremost among those is the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which exceeds what we spend on Medicare, will exceed this year what we spend on defence. Has been growing from 20% in the past few years to about 8 to 10% this year. It was seen to be a solution to get growth in that program down to 8%. I don't think that is a solve. This is a program that supports 500,000 to 600,000 Australians. It's not a universal program, and it's consuming too much of our budget. But there are other items as well. I mean, childcare benefit, there's no means testing for childcare at the moment. You can be on $500,000 household income and you're still getting childcare benefit. What the government has just announced with this first home buyer mortgage insurance and underwriting basically at the first home deposit scheme, that is now available regardless of assets or means or family wealth. Again, that's a subsidy that we shouldn't be giving. So I think we need to restore a means-based welfare and entitlement system. We need to restore some of the principle of user pays, which was a very fashionable term in the 80s and 90s. And at a macro level, we need to rein in government spending, including, the size of government departments. And we will need to adopt, I think, quite blunt measures like an efficiency dividend on government departments, like we had in the Howard government era.
I hope I don't come across as being cynical, but having followed politics the last 50 years, it sort of rubs off a bit. Neville Wran was elected on the 1st of May 76. He went early on the 7th of October 78. Malcolm Fraser scored the biggest win in December 1975. He went early 2 years later. Bob Hawke was elected on the 5th of March 83 and went in December 84. The only way it's going to work is if they're fixed 4-year terms.
Yep.
But in 1988, there were 4 referenda questions, and one was the question of 4-year terms.
It was.
And all the 4 were lost. So I'm wondering where we go from here.
I think that's right. I mean, I answered the earlier question from Michael about what I think would be a useful and important constitutional reform, but I'm conscious that 4-year terms has been taken to the public before and rejected. I agree with you that if they're 4-year terms, they should be fixed. I think it would remove a lot of unhelpful speculation that happens and basically consumes political capital and consumes the political cycle. Anytime you're about a year out from when an election is due, speculation starts about when an election might be held. So I think it would be a worthwhile reform. I believe if it had bipartisan support, it could get public support, but I wouldn't consider it to be a sort of first order of business for a government, and not something it's not something the Liberals have as part of our election commitments, but in a theoretical or academic sense, that would be something I'd support.
As you'll be aware, fixed-term 3-year terms were rejected in the 1977 referendum and was bipartisan support. Down the back.
Yes, no fail-safe.
It's on.
Wonderful talk, Senator. Thank you very much. Now, on the topic of energy, will you go to the party room and ask the party to contemplate how we can get cheaper and more reliable energy when all the money that's been spent up to date attempting a transition to wind and solar has produced more expensive energy, with blackouts looming, and massive environmental damage? Can you persuade the party to consider whether something can be done about that?
Thank you for your question. Look, I think the Liberal Party, the coalition, knows how important this issue is, and we will be developing policies that address this. Whether it's, we took to the last election a East Coast gas reservation policy. I think Labor is likely to incorporate or adopt some of that to help bring wholesale gas prices low, which will in turn feed into electricity. We also took a proposal for nuclear power to the last election. I don't think we're necessarily finished with that. I don't think we would be in a position where we would be saying that government would build, own and operate nuclear power generating assets, but I can certainly see us being in a position where we say we would support lifting the legislative ban so that commercial operators can pursue it. And I think we are very conscious that energy is an input into every level of economic activity. It's in the food you consume, it's in the clothing that you wear. Of course, it's in your power and lights at home, it's in manufacturing, but energy is embedded in everything we consume in a modern society. And so a higher cost of energy is reflected in the prices for everything we pay. So I think we will, our policy here is not settled, but the prisms through which we're looking at are lower prices, more abundant gas, and lower emissions. But lower prices and more plentiful supply are high orders of priority for us. I'll come back when we answer the next question.
Thank you for a wonderful address, Senator. I'm shifting gears slightly, but with your wonderful experience in the Middle East and in Israel in particular, how do you feel the ceasefire will play out, please?
Thank you for your question. It took longer than I thought to get to the Middle East, so I'm delighted we're there. So I might just give, with your indulgence, Gerard, just a slightly longer answer to give my sense of optimism about that. Firstly, I would say that what has been agreed already is significant. I mean, the last of the remaining living hostages being released, the 20 people who were held for over 2 years in unimaginable conditions. I mean, I've met with hostages who've been released. I've met with the families of hostages who were still being held when I met with them. I know what a all-consuming personal and societal and national anguish this has been caused in Israel. But the longer it stood as well, it was sort of an affront to civilization, I think, that a military actor would take civilians hostage and use it consistently as military leverage. These people were not combatants. They were not, military personnel. They were not treated in accordance with the laws of war. They weren't visited by the Red Cross or anything else that happened in wartime. So I'm very pleased that has happened. And I'm also very pleased that a ceasefire has been reached on the back of that, because I think the release of the hostages was one of Israel's main military objectives, rightly and understandably so. The other one was that Hamas can play no future role in the governance of Gaza, and this agreement, if implemented in full, will fulfil that objective. In the meantime, a ceasefire allows civilians in Gaza to return to their homes and move freely. It will allow humanitarian aid to move in more quickly. It will allow the civilian populations suffering in Gaza to be somewhat ameliorated. So I think that's very positive. But I think we need to, when we're looking ahead, we need to understand how this has come about. It didn't come about because more people marched at the Opera House or on the Harbour Bridge saying ceasefire now. Those people still seem to be marching, interestingly enough. I haven't quite worked out why that's the case. It came about because of two things. One, there's been a pretty dramatic regional realignment of forces over the past 2 years, caused by the war and the military actions that have been consequent upon that. And it's come about because of unrelenting diplomatic and military pressure on Hamas. And I think that's what people need to understand. We are where we are because, as Clausewitz said, war is the continuation of politics by other means, or diplomacy by other means, and war is what's resorted to when diplomacy is not working. What war has done in this case is change the configurations to allow diplomacy to work again. Now, what's happened is the forces in the region that have basically had a sort of have been the forces opposed to modernity, would be how I put it, which has basically been Iran and its terrorist proxies, and in some cases client states in the region. So Iran, the Assad regime in Syria, Lebanon, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas in Gaza. That entire bloc has taken a beating as a result of this war. Hezbollah's senior leadership has been decapitated. They've lost their stranglehold and grip on the arms of the state in Lebanon. Hamas has been, decimated, not annihilated, but certainly decimated. The Assad regime has been toppled, and the Iranian regime has been humbled and forced to focus only on its domestic problems. And what that's allowed to happen is basically there's sort of the more enlightened forces in the Middle East, those countries that want to trade and coexist and engage with the modern economy and embrace technology and improve the living standards for their people, that do not have a sort of nihilistic world vision, they've suddenly got some breathing space. So this is the group of countries, includes Israel, but it includes the United Arab Emirates, includes Saudi Arabia, includes the Gulf states, it includes Egypt and Jordan. They've now got some breathing space, and they're able to move a bit more freely. And the other thing that's happened, as I said, is the military and diplomatic pressure on Hamas. The military pressure has been important. If Israel had not shown its willingness to go into Gaza City and to pursue Hamas, without an end state, I don't think Hamas would have capitulated. They hoped, Hamas, that the United States or the international community would reign in Israel at some point. And the United States under Trump said they were not willing to do so if Hamas would not come to the table, and the international community was unable to do so. That has been a factor. And the other factor has been Hamas's main outside patrons, Qatar, Egypt and Turkey, had started to see Hamas as a liability rather than an asset, their support to Hamas. Qatar, has now been hit twice, once by Iran, once by Israel, but partly for hosting Hamas. Turkey and Egypt, I think, saw an opportunity to basically get in good graces with the new US administration, reassert some relevance in the region and shed what had become a sort of problematic child for them. And so their pressure on Hamas was important as well. And I think for those reasons, I'm not naively optimistic, but relatively optimistic about the future, because to do as the United States has done, and President Trump, to his credit, has done, to unite that whole group of countries, from Egypt to Turkey to Indonesia to Saudi Arabia to Israel to Lebanon, in a view that the region will be a better place without Hamas in power, and to not have any sort of naysayers have any kind of influence anymore. No terrorist groups like Hezbollah can pose a threat anymore. Iran is no longer a strategic threat to the region. That means that everyone is basically locked into this one goal and one objective. There's no interest in breaking out. So I think, I don't think Hamas is going to sort of voluntarily relinquish its power, but I think the pressure and the accountability that can be brought to bear on it, through this new constellation of actors that military action and the US president has helped create, means that I don't think they'll have a lot of room to move or make mischief.
Thanks, David. Enjoyed your speech very much.
Thanks,
but it
Ben.
didn't do much for my depression about the future
Just
of
think of the
Australia.
Sydney
I mean.
Olympics and how we came back from Montreal.
Yeah, I'd rather talk about that, actually. I was at the 56 Olympics and saw Dumas and the guy
Michael.
Michael Porter, wasn't it? Chilla Porter.
Oh, Christian Porter's father. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's in the high jump.
In the high jump, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
they went into the night, and they called it a draw at that point, and came back the next morning. I wasn't old enough to be there, but my dad was an official. That's the wrong story I started on. I just had two quick questions. Do you have any idea of what Albo and Chalmers and Bowen's vision for Australia is? Have they articulated it at any point that you've been aware of, or do you know them well enough to know that?
Yes, I do. Do you have a second question as well? Do you want
I
me to
do, yeah.
Give me the
I
second
think
one
you're
as well.
letting the business community off a little bit. You didn't even mention it in the bulk of your talk.
Yeah.
And the truth is, large business is not investing in Australia. They're looking for places other than Australia to invest. How can we turn that around? I mean, I don't have an answer, but I thought you might.
Yeah, okay. Very good questions. Thanks, Peter. Look, I think Anthony Albanese does have a vision for Australia, and I think it's a troubling one. And I think he's been quite revealing of it. I think if you read a long interview, I think he gave to Troy Bramston at the Australian, would have been shortly after the election, he's quite open about it. His vision, his ambition is to be the most electorally successful Labor leader of the modern era. It's not to transform Australia. It's not to give Australians greater opportunity. It's not to make sure we're prepared for a more difficult century ahead. It's not to, give everyone a better start in life or, improve the level of education or move us up the piece of ranking. It's to be the most electorally successful Labor Prime Minister of the modern era. What does that mean? He needs to get re-elected as many times as he can. He wants to be a hero in the pantheon of Labor leaders, basically. And I think that is a chilling vision. I mean, for a politician in a democratic political system to say their ambition is to hold power for as long as possible, not to do anything with it, not as a means to some greater end, but as an end in itself, I think is staggering. And I think, I don't know if Jim Chalmers is of the same view, but I think that's Anthony Albanese's. And I think if you adopt that framework, you can see everything he does fits within that. You can't falsify it. In terms of a thesis, it's hard to falsify. On the business community. Yeah, look, I think that's you make a fair point. I don't think the business community is necessarily always a friend of competition and economic dynamism in Australia because they have a lot of self-interest in the status quo. And so you always need to be careful of that. But I also don't think that the business community has been prepared to be loud enough in defence of sound economic principles when the test has come. They've taken a kind of corporate affairs lobbyist attitude, which is we always need to get on with the government of the day, so we'll pull our punches.
Thanks, Dave. I just, having lived not quite back to the 56, I was too young, 56 Olympics, but I have lived through all the 80s and 90s reform. And to me, what Albanese's got in the way of a steady hand on the tiller is he's more like Malcolm Fraser. He doesn't want to do the big leap to do any change or reform. Now, the tragedy is that when all the discussion outside of politics around industrial relations was going on, we had a Liberal government and it fell to Bob Hawke. And the irony was that the Hawke government really began the changes that we needed in the industrial landscape. We don't have a party that's going to take over from that unless we have a strong enough opposition to do it, because you'll just end up, people seem to be almost comatose with government spending. It's the Western world way now, even the United States. So how do you break that comatose, that coma, and who's going to do it?
If I could just briefly, before you answered, it is fair to say that John Howard helped to drive that Hawke-Keating reform
Yeah,
from
I agree with that,
opposition.
but Fraser
Yeah.
didn't really do
Yes.
it.
Okay.
Look,
Final answer?
yeah, it's. I think your phrase then, Anna, that people are sort of comatose with government spending is a very accurate observation, and I worry about that. I mean, that there's too many. The government, in a sort of a Victorian and Queensland Labor model, has been basically growing the class of people who are dependent on it in some way or other, whether it's through employment directly through the public service, or whether it's through entitlement schemes, or whether it's through, cosy sector by sector arrangements. They've created a whole lot of vested interests, and that can be quite hard to break. And what normally is required to break it is some sort of burning platform moment, some sort of shock. Whether it's like the Montreal Olympics shocked us, right? The 82-83 recession, the Paul Keating's Banana Republic speech, that was in the end designed to shock us. Lee Kuan Yew saying we were going to become the poor white trash of Asia. I think it's something like that will be needed to snap us out of it. But it's a hard thing because, these things, economies, economic reform, productivity, they move at a glacial pace, right? It's not like you go to the grand final and you lose a match and everyone sees what's happened. You had a terrible season. It happens more slowly, and we've been slowly deteriorating and going backwards. To draw just one parallel, Europe's been in this sort of situation now for probably since the global financial crisis. I mean, Europe from the post-war era to the late 1980s, early 1990s was closing the gap with the US in terms of GDP per capita. Since the global financial crisis, that's sort of blown right apart. And Australia as well. I mean, Australia was close to on par with the US in terms of wealth per person not that long ago, 10 to 15 years ago. But the United States is, out-innovating and outperforming us. How do we come to, recognise and know this? I suspect it will have to be some sort of external shock. I just hope it's not, a particularly serious one.
Many thanks. I'll be brief. So many thanks to Senator Sharma for another fine performance across issues of economics, politics, and thanks to the question, the Middle East. Terrific answer. I introduce Senator Sharma as an Assistant Minister. With a speech like this tonight and answers like this to the questions that came up tonight, it shouldn't be long before you're in the main team. We wish you well.